Before starting this episode, I would like to mention that I'm going to tackle some heavy subjects today, such as eating disorder, body shaming, mental health issues. If you are not comfortable with these topics, you can skip this episode and listen to lighter episodes. You may have heard of Caitlin Hoashi. She is an American gymnast who competed for UCLA, so the University of California. She received 6 times the All-American honor, which means that she was considered one of the best athletes in gymnastics in the US. She was also a member of the US Gymnastics Junior national team 4 times and the winner of the 2013 American Cup. She has received several times the highest note, which is a 10. I'm talking about her today because at 16 years old, she stepped out of elite gymnastics because of bullying and comments on her appearance. As she writes in an essay for NBC News, and I'm quoting, "When I stepped away from the sport, I was left with someone I didn't even know. The only thing I did know was that I didn't like who I was. I didn't want to be great again. I correlated greatness with misery. But I now realize that greatness was not the problem. It was the culture, the environment that seemed to come along with being great." End of the quote. She also writes, quote, "I have said that gymnastics can be abusive and brutal. That was my experience. I felt trapped in a world where authority figures were dictating my future. But in actuality, it's not the sport that is cruel, it's the culture." End of the quote. In today's episode, I want to discuss that culture that Caitlin is writing about. Why is the way the body looks so important, specifically in gymnastics? And what are the consequences of having strict standards for gymnasts? This conversation is about women in gymnastics, but men are also affected by those standards. If we look at first the origins of the term gymnastics, it derived from a Greek word meaning to exercise naked. And it was applied in ancient Greece to all exercises practiced in the gymnasium where male athletes did indeed exercise unclothed. This is not to say that gymnastics originated in Greece, because there is actually evidence that shows that forms of gymnastics were practiced in different cultures around the world, such as in Egypt, Crete, and China, for example. In the 1970s, a big shift happened to gymnastics. Whereas before, athletes were of different ages, usually no younger than 17 or 18, in the 70s, younger girls began competing in events. For example, the Romanian Nadia Comaneci was only 14 when she became the first gymnast to be awarded a perfect score of 10 at the Olympic Games. Girls like Nadia, who had been training for many years, often had a delay in their first menstrual cycle because of the exercise intensity, and thus would delay their puberty too. Some of these younger gymnasts were also alleged to have used doping techniques to delay the onset of physical maturation and its resulting changes to a gymnast's center of gravity and weight. Whether these allegations are true or not, by 2000, the age requirement for Olympic participants in gymnasts had been raised to 16 to offset some of these problems. But the fact that elite athletes were getting younger created, as a side effect, the culture mentioned by Caitlin. This shift made the idea that a gymnast's body has to be thin and without curves more prevalent in the sport, which consequently led to many issues. The first consequence is that puberty becomes an extremely stressful time for gymnasts. Puberty in itself is already complicated for every teenager around the world, regardless of the sport they do or if they don't even exercise. They have to adapt to a body that is constantly changing and that is looking less and less like the body they lived in the previous years. In the context of gymnastics, studies have shown that gymnasts see their body as quote-unquote out of control as they manage puberty and try to keep up the appearance of the gymnastic body ideal across training and competition spaces. Let's not forget that after all, gymnastics is a sport where the control of the body is extremely important. And for example, they are expected to maintain control and regain or at least conceal any loss of control as much as possible if mistakes are made during a routine, for example. And so this high level of controlled body usage creates highly disciplined bodies that are vulnerable to a loss of control. And that can also lead to athletes not feeling comfortable or safe to talk about their changing bodies with their coaches, for example. Of course, this totally depends on the coach and the culture of the environment. We can also mention the leotard worn by athletes, which reveals the body and thus makes it impossible to hide any change in the way the body looks and makes athletes actually feel embarrassed if they have gained weight due to puberty or other reasons. On top of that, some studies have shown that during competitions, judges usually find more aesthetically pleasing skinnier athletes. Even though a heavier athlete might perform better, just because she has more muscle or is older than a skinnier one or younger one, if their routines are equally as good, judges usually rate smaller athletes better because of their preference. So if we put together the importance of body control in gymnastics, the expectation of a certain body type by coaches and judges, and the fact that elite athletes have been practicing this sport since childhood, it is normal to expect that the relation to their body is central for gymnasts. Studies actually show that girls who practice gymnastics feel highly responsible at an early age for how they present themselves and display signs of their puberty. Going back to Caitlin's example, the culture she experienced made her feel alienated from her body. But when she started gymnastics in UCLA, thanks to her coach, she felt good again about practicing gymnastics. And that's exactly what studies have demonstrated. The gymnastics environment still appears to remain very indecisive about how to respond to puberty, especially when we take into account the fact that there are a lot of male coaches training young girls. And there are still to this day a lot of coaches whose idea of ideal gymnast's body do not allow for womanly bodies that have gone through puberty to exist in the sport. And this leads me to my next point, which is the fact that girls and women in gymnastics are so aware of their bodies makes weight concerns more prevalent. And these concerns can sometimes turn into eating disorders. Researchers have pointed out to the fact that girls in gymnastics are more concerned about their weight than girls who play sports that are not related to aesthetics or girls who play no sports. And these concerns start as early as age 5 to 7. Elite gymnasts diet more often than other women, but according to studies, it's not because they have a more negative opinion of their bodies than other women who diet. Whereas many women believe that thin is beautiful and thus want to lose weight, gymnasts seem more convinced that thin is going to win. And that's the reason why they diet. And this totally correlates with what I said before. Judges, coaches, and athletes all have a certain idea of what a gymnast's body should look like. And this creates an environment where there is shame, there is guilt, and there is also fear of not performing well enough attached to bigger bodies. And to a certain extent, the amount of training required to be an elite gymnast is going to create a leaner and more muscular body. Their idea of an ideal gymnast body makes sense in a way. But the way a body looks also depends on genetics. And so one elite athlete might be super short and super lean, and another one might be a bit more bulky or whatever. And they both have the same training regimen. And so this level of body scrutiny can lead athletes to develop an eating disorder to achieve a body that looks more like the ideal. According to studies among gymnasts, the pressure to be thinner comes essentially from coaches who often make negative comments about eating, who monitor the athlete's weight and advise them on food restriction. And although at first athletes might diet for better performance and to win, at some point what started as something to get better in their sport can actually hinder their performance and health in the long run. They can get injured more often, for example. They can also feel more stressed, less rested, and tired more often. I've spoken about RED-S in my podcast, which is relative energy deficiency in sports. But basically, RED-S is a syndrome of poor health and declining athletic performance that happens when athletes do not get enough fuel through food to support their energy demands of their daily lives and training. It can lead to many issues over time, such as the loss of menstrual cycle, an increased risk of stress fractures, and early onset osteoporosis, more infections and colds due to the decreased immunity, low heart rate, causing dizziness and the potential for long-term heart damage and mental health issues like depression and anxiety. If we look at the Olympics in Paris last summer, the gymnasts who won all had different body types. This goes to show that there is no ideal gymnast's body. Although some judges might have a preferred body type, this should never influence the score of performances. Similarly, coaches should not push a certain aesthetic on their trainees and should be there to help them navigate their puberty and be healthy. There are still a lot of mindset changes that have to happen in gymnastics for it to become a more supportive and open environment for athletes. That being said, the story of Caitlin shows us that it is possible to have great coaches who try to bring out the best in athletes. And as athletes of all shapes and sizes get more recognition through their accomplishments, it becomes harder and harder to say that in gymnastics, thin always wins. And that's all for today. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Leave a rating on my podcast if you are on Spotify. It would really, really help me. If you are on YouTube, leave a like, a comment, and subscribe to the channel. And I'll see you in the next one.